we'll kind of back up just a little bit, and we'll tell you that Lyndon Johnson left his position as congressional secretary in 1937 because he wanted to run for Congress, and he would be attempting to fill the seat of James P. Buchanan, who had actually died in office. So the idea behind that is you run for that election, you win the election, but you only serve the rest of that person's term, and then you'd have to be elected to your own. And I told you that Lady Bird provided the money for his campaign. She took $10,000 of an inheritance that she had gotten from her mother's estate to help start her husband's political career. And he was successful in his bid to replace Buchanan in the House of Representatives from Texas. We then mentioned that he was re-elected to his own term in 1938 and also was re-elected to his second term in 1940. And it was in 1941 that he announced he would run for the United States Senate. Now this was kind of interesting too, because in this election he is going to again run for an unexpired term because Senator Morris Shepherd also died in office. So he's going to run this time for the Senate, but he is going to run for an unexpired term trying to take the seat of Senator Morris Shepherd of Texas, who also died in office.
So do they have to die in the state that you want to run for?
Yeah.
So Morris was a senator?
He was a senator, but he had died in office also, and so Johnson decided to run for his unexpired term, just like he did for Buchanan's. Well, unfortunately, he campaigned hard, but lost this Senate election and simply went back to the House and finished his term there. Okay? So, again, in 1941, Johnson announced he would run for the United States Senate. Again, it would be for an unexpired term, this time for Senator Morris Shepherd, who had died in office. He campaigned hard but lost and went back to the House. Now, look at the time period. What's going to happen next in his life? No, we're not there yet. We're in 1941. Very good. Pearl Harbor is attacked, and now we're at war. He's like everybody else. He joins the United States Navy and actually earns the Silver Star, for heroism. So events of Pearl Harbor result in Johnson enlisting in the United States Navy. And in the United States Navy, he earned the Silver Star for heroics.
So, did someone take over his position, or does it just wait for it?
Well, he finished out his term and somebody else got elected. Well, what did he do after World War II? He got out of politics. He and Lady Bird purchased a radio station, then later added a television station as well. So they kind of went into the broadcasting business, first buying a radio station, and then buying a television station. And with the money they made on that, they invested in real estate. In other words, they bought and sold property. Where they buy a piece of property, fix it up, sell it for more money. And the whole reason why they bought this radio station and bought this television station and went into real estate was to earn enough money so he could do what? Not yet, pretty close. Take another run at the Senate. Okay, he wanted to be a senator, so they saved their money from the radio business and the television station and all the money they had invested and made in the real estate. All those adventures had the goal of earning enough money for another Senate run. Now, this was a really interesting election because this is one of those things like if you have a basketball tournament where two good teams get on the same side of the bracket, really whoever wins that game is probably going to win the championship. And it was kind of the same thing in the Senate election because Johnson's toughest fight wouldn't be in the general election against the Republican winner on that side. It's going to be in the primary when he runs against another Democratic candidate to get the nomination, or you see what I'm saying, so he could run for the Senate. In elections, you have primary and general. So if Brian and I and Aurora all want to be mayor of Worland and we're all in the same political party, and only one person from the other party, Peyton, wants to be mayor, she's in the general election, and we have to have an election to see who gets to run against Peyton for the mayorship, okay? And that's kind of where Johnson was. The Republican candidate was kind of weak. So who was going to win this Senate seat was whoever won the primary within the Democratic Party. So it was a really pretty tough election. And the man that Johnson would be running against was a pretty popular politician. He was the former governor of Texas, Coke Stevenson. And Coke Stevenson had retired from the governorship the year before, but then Coke Stevenson decided he wanted to make a run at the Senate, and he and Johnson both just happened to be Democrats. So the general election is going to be a really big election. Johnson's going to have to run against very popular former Texas Governor Coke Stevenson, who had retired from office the year before. The winner will walk into the general election and win in a landslide, probably. But this one's going to be tight, okay? Now, this is interesting. I want you to write this down. Johnson campaigned hard, and here he won. Here was the tally. He had, write this down just for the fun of it. He had 494,191 votes. 494,191. 494,191. Here's what Stevenson had. 494,104. 494,104. 87 votes Johnson won by. 87. 494, 191 to 494, 104. In a Senate election, 87 votes. Now what would you have if that happened? Recount after recount after recount. But that's how close the election was. Well, as a result of his close win over Stevenson, he received a nickname that he did not enjoy the remainder of his life, and that nickname was Landslide Lyndon. It was sarcasm that he had won by such a small margin. They gave him the name Landslide Lyndon. He did not particularly like that, didn't see that as very complimentary, but it stayed with him the rest of his life. As a result of his victory over Coke Stevenson, he received the nickname Landslide Lyndon, which stayed with him the remainder of his political career, not in a very positive manner. So he wins the general. He does very little campaigning, or excuse me, he wins the primary. He does very little campaigning in the general election, and he was easily elected to the United States Senate. He crushed his Republican opponent in the general election. So really it was between the two in the primary, just like you have the two good basketball teams on the same side of the bracket, okay? So, despite very little campaigning, Johnson was easily elected to the United States Senate in that general election. He defeated his Republican opponent 2-1, and twice as many votes as his opponent. Well, in January of 1953, Johnson was elected Minority Leader of the United States Senate. In January of 1953, Lyndon Johnson was elected Minority Leader of the United States Senate. He was only 44 years old and was the youngest person in American history to that point ever to be elected Minority Leader. Okay? So he was moving up in the Senate, doing well. January of 1953, Johnson was elected Minority Leader of the United States Senate at the age of 44, becoming the youngest person ever to serve in that position. Well, what happened in January of 1955 when he was 46? He was elected Majority Leader of the United States Senate. Senate Majority Leader, that's the highest ranking senator in the nation. Usually has way more power than even the Vice President of the United States. So in January of 1955, at the age of 46, he's elected Senate Majority Leader. And again, he's the youngest man in American history to assume that political position. So he's making good hay. No.
At 56 years old?
He was, no, in 1955 he was elected at the age of 46. And he was the youngest Senate Majority Leader in American history. Now, who's president during the time he's Senate Majority Leader? Eisenhower, very good. And what party is Eisenhower? Is he the same as Johnson or opposite? He's opposite. And as Senate Majority Leader, Johnson worked very well with President Eisenhower. Despite their political party differences, the two worked together very, very well. Well, in July of 1955, still at the age of 46, Johnson suffers a severe heart attack. Okay, in July of 1955, he's just 46 years old and he suffers a severe heart attack. Now, where would he have been treated and where would he have been in the hospital since he was a Navy person? Or in Washington, D.C. Where did Kennedy go for his autopsy? Because he was a naval officer. Bethesda. Bethesda Naval Hospital is where he was taken, and he continued to work from his hospital bedside during his recovery. Never really took a day off, hardly. So Senator Johnson continued to work from his hospital bed after his heart attack. He was in the hospital for 5 weeks at Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland. 5 weeks, and he worked from his bedside almost every day. Almost every day he worked from his hospital
Did they
bedside.
have TVs in the hospital those times?
You know, I don't. They had TVs. They were pretty, you know, oh no, this is 50, oh boy, not probably.
So what did you do in the hospital?
Well, they brought his stuff. You didn't have the internet then. You did everything by, people came and got stuff and took it, I'm sure, as aides, you know. Now, after his heart attack, you'd think a guy'd slow down. Historians say that Johnson worked harder than ever before after his heart attack. And he was once quoted as saying, quote, "I never think of politics more than 18 hours a day." That's the kind of worker he was. So historians say that he probably worked harder than ever after the heart attack. And he was once quoted as saying, "I never think of politics more than 18 hours a day." Now, you probably don't have to write this next thing down, but it ties into the profile. We know that he had intentions on the presidency in 1960, right? But John F. Kennedy was nominated on the first ballot by the Democratic Party, and so what did he settle for? The vice presidency. Now, I will tell you this, his experience as vice president was not a very positive time for him for 2 reasons. There were 2 reasons why his time as vice president was not very positive for him. Matter of fact, many of his close friends and colleagues stated that his years as vice president were the most miserable years of his life. Here are the 2 reasons why it wasn't very positive. First of all, we mentioned before, he was the most powerful man in the Senate. He was a Senate Majority Leader. He had way more power when he had been Senate Majority Leader than he ever had as vice president. Most people think the vice presidency is about the closest thing there is to falling off the face of the earth politically, because you get sent here and you get sent there, and the Kennedys did not use him because John Kennedy depended on Bobby and Kenneth O'Donnell and David Powers and those people in his inner circle. Didn't really do much with Lyndon Johnson. He sent Lyndon Johnson on a lot of trips, okay? That was the first reason why it wasn't positive. The second reason it bothered Vice President Johnson so much is because he did not enjoy playing, quote, second fiddle to a less experienced man. He did not like playing second fiddle to a less experienced man. Now, you band kids, what's that metaphor mean? Playing second fiddle.
Not quite, but
You're not first chair, right? And God, how come that kid gets to be first chair saxophone? I know that I've been in band way longer than he has, and I'm way better than him. Gee, that's not fair. And that's kind of what Johnson felt like. Why is this guy president? I mean, I was Senate Majority Leader. I was a powerful man. This inexperienced guy from Massachusetts, Senator Kennedy, who didn't even attend half the roll call votes we had when he was senator, he gets to be president, so he was a little miffed about that. And so the vice presidency wasn't very positive because he didn't enjoy playing second fiddle to a less experienced man, and he was the most powerful man in the Senate and lost a ton of power as vice president. And as I mentioned, close friends and colleagues often stated that his years in the vice presidency were the most miserable of his life. Give you an idea about the Kennedys. The Kennedys picked Johnson because they wanted to win the election in 1960 because he would carry the South. There was no question that John Kennedy was seriously considering replacing Johnson as his vice presidential candidate in '64. No question. And there was a lot of names thrown around, but he just, I think if Kennedy's not assassinated, there's no question Lyndon Johnson's not on the ballot in '64.
Can you go back to being majority leader?
He could. He could go back. He could go. He'd have to be elected to the Senate. He'd have to go through the process, but he could. Yep.
It's weird that every position he wanted, someone died so he could get.
Yeah, isn't that crazy?
Maybe he killed
Three, what's that? Maybe
Maybe
he killed
he
them.
killed
There you
them
go,
all.
here's the conspiracy girl at it again.
Oh,
Now, you know this stuff here, you know this part here. After the assassination of President Kennedy in November of '63, Johnson became the nation's 36th president. I will tell you, we'll cover this, he was elected to his own term in 1964, which helped him move out of the Kennedy shadow, okay? So he was elected to his own term in 1964 to get out of the Kennedy shadow. Really surprising, and we'll get to this when we get into Vietnam, he could have run in '68, right? Because he assumed Kennedy's term, and most people thought there was no question that he would, but he shocked the nation on national television during the middle and the pressures of the Vietnam War, stating he would not run for another term. Everybody couldn't believe it, which opened the door for Robert Kennedy, which we'll talk about later. So Johnson decides not to run for re-election in 1968, mainly due to the pressures of the Vietnam War. Now this is a great quote. President Johnson was not a bad president. He did a ton for civil rights. But the Vietnam War killed him. I mean, it just killed him. And here's what historians, according to historians, President Johnson's downfall as president was the war in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, because he was, quote, obsessed by it, possessed by it, and ruined by it. There's no question in the world, there's no question that the Vietnam War overshadowed anything he did positive in his presidency because of the first war we ever protested. We'll get into that. The first war that people felt that Americans, GIs, were killed unnecessarily in a war that we shouldn't be in. A war that historians believe, and we'll talk about later, President Kennedy would have never been involved in, ever. Okay? But it happened, and we'll get to that later. Well, after Richard Nixon was inaugurated as president in January of 1969, Lyndon Johnson retired to his ranch in Texas. So after the inauguration of Richard Nixon in January of '59, Nixon was elected in the election of 1968, Johnson simply retired to his ranch in Texas. And he did what all presidents did, or do after that. He wrote, in 1971, he wrote published his memoirs, and the Lyndon B. Johnson Library opened where again? I think I told you that. Where they opened up the Presidential Library? University of Texas at Austin. If you go to University of Texas at Austin and go to the library, it's the Lyndon B. Johnson Library. Okay? So he did what every president did. In 1971, he published his memoirs, and the Lyndon B. Johnson Library opened officially at the University of Texas. In 1972, President Johnson suffered a heart attack and survived. In 1972, he suffers a second heart attack and survives. In 1972, Johnson suffers a second heart attack and survives. However, he will not survive a third and dies on January 22nd, 1973. Less than 10 years after the assassination of John Kennedy. January 22nd, 1973. So in 1972, Johnson suffers a second heart attack and survives. However, he will not survive a third, and he died on January 22nd, 1973. As was done, yeah, go ahead.
Did they have a bad health or just ate bad or why do you have so many heart attacks?
You know, a lot of that's hereditary. You know, I don't know what his eating habits were, but I mean, it's a lot of that's hereditary, to be honest with you. And so I don't know. I don't think anybody that coaches or is in politics or is the president of the United States eats very good. You know what I mean? Because you're stressed out. It's a stressful job, and I think stress has a lot to do with those types of health problems. But I'm not sure on that. As George H.W. Bush was, we just watched that. His body, Johnson's body, lay in state at both the Lyndon B. Johnson Library in Austin and the Capitol Rotunda. If the president dies, they always lay in state at the Capitol Rotunda. And he was buried next to his mother and father at the family graveyard in Stonewall, Texas. So after his death, he laid in state at both the Lyndon B. Johnson Library in Austin, actually laid at the Rotunda first, and then the library in Austin second, and then he was buried next to his parents in the family cemetery on the ranch in Stonewall, Texas. So your question might be, what? After Lyndon's death? Thank you. Whatever happened to Lady Bird Johnson? She never remarried after his death. Never remarried.
How old is Johnson when he married?
Well, let's see, 1908 to 73 would be,
Oh.
that area. Now, you know what Mrs. Johnson did is she dedicated her time and effort to both the Highway Beautification Act, which we'll talk about in a minute. You know what that is if you're in 4-H, or what's Highway Beautification Act? Anybody know?
Cleaning up after?
Yeah, you clean up the highway and you, like, you know, you have a stretch like the Warland LDS Church has this stretch, and then the Boy Scouts have this stretch. What's that? Yeah, kind of. And you take a stretch and clean up the highway. Yep. So she dedicated her life to the Highway Beautification Act, and also this one's important: the National Wildflower Research Center. You know what her favorite flower was? Daffodil. Now, when we walk from Arlington Cemetery over the bridge to the Lincoln Memorial, we're going to walk through a little park of daffodil trees that's dedicated to Lady Bird Johnson. There's a big plaque there that says that. Okay? Yeah.
It was the National Wildflower what?
Research Center. Yeah. And so she dedicated her time and effort to both the Highway Beautification Act and the National Wildlife Research Center. The National Wildlife Research Center, if you care, is a nonprofit organization devoted to preserving and reintroducing native plants into planned landscapes. And you'll see that when we walk across. I'll stop and we'll show you. I'll say, remember we talked about that in class? This is what was dedicated to Lady Bird Johnson for her efforts with the Wildflower Research Center. Well, she eventually died.